This episode of Ben Franklin's World is brought to you by Cornell University Press. In addition to printing newspapers, almanacs, and pamphlets, Benjamin Franklin also published books. Between 1728 and 1748, Franklin published 32 books, which was more than any other printer in North America. Like Franklin, Cornell University Press publishes books too, and they do so with a goal that Franklin surely would have liked: to disseminate fundamental and practical knowledge. Cornell University Press believes that history contains fundamental and practical knowledge, and that important history makes great reading. If you believe this too, then you might really enjoy some of their books. Books such as Julie Holcomb's Moral Commerce, Quakers and the Transatlantic Boycott of the Slave Labor Economy. In Moral Commerce, Julie Holcomb explores the free produce movement from its 17th century Quaker origins through its late 19th century decline. For more than 100 years, British and American abolitionists used the free produce movement to starve slavery of its economic sustenance by pointing out that the purchase of goods represented political acts. For example, if someone wanted to buy a new suit, were they buying a suit made of free labor wool or from slave-grown cotton? By tracing the free produce movement, Holcomb reveals the possibilities and limitations of moral commerce. Check out the show notes page for this episode to learn more about moral commerce and other great titles from Cornell University Press.
Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 111 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. Neither colonial North America nor the United States have developed apart from the rest of the world. In fact, since their founding, both the colonies and the United States have participated in the politics, economics, and cultures of a very large Atlantic world, a world that includes Europe, Africa, the Caribbean, and North and South America. Now, although the colonies in early United States centered most of their activities in this Atlantic world, every so often, the politics, economics, and cultures of lands in the Pacific and Indian Oceans intersected with and influenced those of the Atlantic world, which, when you think about it, makes the world of early America an even bigger and more vast place to study. That's why today we're going to explore the origins of the English trade with India and how that trade connected and intersected with the English North American colonies. Our guide for this investigation is Jonathan Eacott, an associate professor of history at the University of California, Riverside, and author of Selling Empire: India and the Making of Britain and America, 1700 to 1830. During our exploration, Jonathan reveals how trade between England and India developed, the English East India Company and its creation, and the role that England's trade with India played in the development of the English North American colonies. But first, did you know that the best way to find a new podcast is by word-of-mouth recommendations? Recommendations from friends and family members is how podcasts like Ben Franklin's World find new listeners. So if you enjoy this podcast, why not tell someone else about it? Are you ready for our exploration of the vast early American world? Let's go meet our guest historian.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Our guest is an associate professor of history at the University of California, Riverside. His research interests include early America, British India, and the British Empire. Today, he joins us to discuss his book, Selling Empire: India and the Making of Britain and America, 1700 to 1830. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Jonathan Eacott.
Well, thanks very much for having me.
We're glad you could join us, Jonathan, because we're anxious to explore India and the British trade with India. Now, in your book, Selling Empire, you remark that from the late 16th century, English conceptions of India, and India's products were instrumental in cultivating and starting a trade between England and India. So, would you tell us how the English viewed India, and India's products in the late 16th century?
India for the British was something of power, wealth, of a lot of really amazing goods and stuff. And it was so impressive to them, actually, that they started to call other places Indias. And so they sort of had this idea that they could find Indias all over the world. And these Indias would provide them with power, wealth, and really cool stuff. And hopefully they could find Indias that they could actually take control of, because India itself was too powerful and too wealthy for them to even sort of imagine taking control of. So they hoped they'd find these other places that would offer them the same kinds of benefits. But a lot of people also feared that it wasn't going to be so beneficial, that if they got really wealthy and they sort of looked at the Spanish in Mesoamerica and said, look what the Spanish Indies have done to the Spanish, and they've corrupted them and made them immoral, and that might happen to us too. So there was sort of people really optimistic about it, but other people that were kind of nervous about the potential of multiple Indias.
So, strictly speaking, India didn't always mean the India we know as a country. In the late 16th century, it seems like India was really an idea for the English, which makes us wonder, why did the English consider places with different peoples and goods to be India or Indias and not, say, China or Chinas?
That's a really, really good question. I think it's mostly because China was even farther away, and India was something that was already accessible to the European imagination because the Portuguese had already made some settlements in India. There was a sense that it was more available to Europeans, and not necessarily to conquer, but to engage with. It was still mysterious, and they didn't know a whole lot about it, but it was definitely closer and sort of a little more familiar in their imagination than China. But they also tended to kind of mix all these places together. And John Smith, who's sort of famous in early American history, when he writes about Asia, he's very confused about where things are and what it actually looks like. So for him, it's very muddled. And I think that was pretty typical. He was a pretty educated guy as far as the world was concerned, and even he didn't have a good grasp of what happened beyond the Mediterranean.
And John Smith certainly wasn't alone. It seems like many Europeans in general didn't have a good grasp of Asia and world geography in the 15th and 16th centuries. I mean, when you think about it, didn't Native Americans become Indians to many Europeans because Christopher Columbus thought he had landed in India?
Yes, exactly. That's right.
Now, how did trade between England and India, and for this conversation, we're really talking about the place that we in the 21st century know as India, when did trade develop between England and India, and why did it develop?
For the Europeans, it begins back with the Portuguese, really in the late 15th and early 16th centuries. But for the English, it starts in 1600, and they tried to go earlier, but they sort of floundered around. It wasn't that easy, actually, to figure out how to get there for the English. So they finally really start to do it in 1600, the early 17th century.
If other European countries had been trading with India, why was it so complicated for the English to figure out how to get from England to India?
It was really far away, and they didn't have a lot of experience sailing that far away. And so there had been some English privateers or pirates like Sir Francis Drake that had been in the Indian Ocean, had been in that direction. But in general, there wasn't a lot of knowledge. It was really far away, and England was really on the margins. It was sort of on the margins of the Afro-Eurasian world, the world known to Europeans before the Americas. Literally, if you sort of think about a map, if you put India in the center, which in many ways India was the center of the Afro-Eurasian world. If you put India in the center, England's way over there, kind of hanging right off the edge of the world. And so for them to get all the way to India, the knowledge was hard to get, and it was also expensive.
In earlier conversations, Malcolm Gaskill, Rose Doherty, and Jim Horn all mentioned that there were boosters for the colonies, people who tried to raise money to settle different areas of North America. Was the process similar for India? Was there a group of pro-India boosters who were like, we have to go over there and trade because India has such great goods and trade with India will be great for the economy? Or perhaps even others who worked like anti-boosters saying, trade with India isn't good for the economy because it's just too far away and expensive to trade with?
There's both, but the boosters are pretty aggressive and apparently pretty successful considering that they tend to get people to actually do what they're talking about. And it's really the same boosters, and this is, I hope, one of the takeaways from my book is that it's really the same guys who are interested in colonization in the Americas who want to trade with India. And so as one example, we can think about the guy named Thomas Smith, and Smith was the leader of the Levant Company, which traded to the Ottoman Empire. He was the leader of the East India Company, which traded to India. He was the Virginia Company's treasurer, and he became the leader of the Somers Isle Company to colonize in Bermuda. So you can see in just this one guy, he's sort of connecting all of these places. And the other kind of promoters that weren't investors had the same really sort of broad view of where England should be engaged.
How did someone become a booster? I mean, what attracted someone like Thomas Smith to the India trade?
The opportunity for wealth, but there was a whole other basket of things that they hoped for. There's lots of these different boosters. The two famous ones, Richard Hakluyt and Samuel Purkis. And Samuel Purkis, writing in the 1610s and 1620s, I think he really laid out the justifications most clearly. And he was really hoping that the English were going to be able to sell all kinds of their own products to India, woolens and other English goods. He had imagined that there'd be big markets for this stuff. People like Purkis knew there was a lot of people in India, and so the expectation was they'd want to buy a lot of English stuff. And if they were going to buy this stuff, that was going to require lots of big ships. Big ships would require lots of sailors. Both of these things would be really helpful in defending England as an island, as part of an island that was going to be essential for defense and also for expanding English power. Would provide all kinds of tax revenue, he said, because once these goods were traded back and forth, they could be taxed with duties. And that tax revenue would help, of course, the king and the government overall. And finally, he had this vision of trading with India and going to India, bringing honor. And that when people in India and Asia saw English people and English ships and English traders, they would be impressed by them and that they'd sort of sing their praises. And all of this for Purkis and other people who thought like them, it sort of all added up as a way to exert power and influence globally, but in particular to exert it in Europe against the Catholic Spanish. And so that's one of the sort of driving motivations for all of this, is to be able to respond to Catholic Spain's big empire. And this is after the English had recently defeated the Spanish Armada, and so there's a sense of there could be momentum here of England moving out in the world and really challenging Spain.
When we think of big ships, and when we think about the relationship between England and India, at least for those of us who are steeped in early American history, we think of the English East India Company. Would you tell us about the creation of that company and about who owned and operated it?
Sure. It's created in 1600. They get a charter from Queen Elizabeth, and it's around 200 gentlemen who are involved. About a quarter of these guys are also involved with the Virginia Company. So again, you can see there's this sort of clear relationship here of trade with India and colonization in America. And these 200 people, they invest, they buy shares of the company. And essentially what they create is the same thing as a sort of modern publicly traded corporation in America today. And so it's not really the very first one of these, but it is one of the first big ones where we get it lasting a very long time and we have large numbers of people investing and actually making a lot of profit off of their investments. And these investors select the people who are going to sort of control the company. They call them the court of directors. And these directors really fulfill a role very similar to a board of directors today in a large corporation. And the thing that they have that sort of makes them special, what they get from the Queen, is they get a monopoly over all trade to India. And so nobody from England can compete with them. And they'll have that monopoly for the most part for several hundred years. There's moments at which it's broken and moments at which it's weak, but they do sort of manage to continually renew it.
Could we talk about monopolies for a moment? Because it seems like many European countries were creating trade monopolies. You have the English East India Company, the French East India Company, and the Dutch East and West India Companies, to name but a few. Why were monopolies appealing? I mean, why did these countries charter monopolies instead of supporting free trade to distant lands?
Part of it comes back to the cost involved, and trading with India was expensive and difficult. And it's one of the reasons that the monopoly does manage to survive. And so it's plausible that an open trade certainly could have worked, but people were convinced by the argument that it was going to be easier and better managed with a monopoly, where the resources of individuals could be pooled together to, in the East Indies Company case, they actually didn't own their ships, they rented them, but they had very clear specifications for the ships that they would use. And those ships were very expensive. They were heavily armed, and they could be the sort of thing that a company could produce, but that individuals would really have a hard time producing. And if there wasn't a monopoly, then it would be hard to get people to invest in the company. It was a way to compel people to invest. But from the Queen's side, and increasingly from the side of the British government, these companies, if they were successful, offered real financial benefits. And the East India Company was much more successful than a lot of the other monopoly companies. And so it became, in a sense, a cash cow, something that the Queen or King could draw upon for huge loans to help support the government in times of crisis, particularly in moments of war. And again, if it didn't have that monopoly, it would be hard to kind of compel the support of the company for the crown.
Now, it seems like England was establishing both colonies in North America and its trade with India at the same time. So when did England combine its interests? When did English North America get involved with the English-India trade? And how did English-American colonists in the 17th century view India, India's, and East India products?
In one sense, it's from sort of the very beginning that colonization in North America is about India. And figures like John Smith, again, are in their writings are pretty conscious of the fact that they expect that North America is going to provide the benefits of India without the risks. And so the sense is that India is already too wealthy and powerful to control. But North America looks different from a political perspective. It looks like somewhere that the English might be able to exert control. And if they can do that, then the hope is that they won't have the risks of being corrupted by non-Christian people like the people of India, and that they will be able to sort of better control the trade and generate for themselves all of the profit off the production of what used to be India goods. And so they're really driven by this idea that they're going to recreate these Indias. And when they look at a map, they sort of see, well, Virginia looks like it's on a similar latitude to India. And so they imagine that it's going to provide a similar climate and that they can take the goods and commodities that are grown in India, things like cotton, silk, and spices, and they'll just transplant them to Virginia or Bermuda. And in these places, they can recreate India for themselves. So it's really right from the beginning that the colonial promoters and those people who are going have this idea that they're going to be able to recreate their very own India that'll be kind of even better than the original India in Asia.
This is a bit mind-blowing, Jonathan, because when we think back to what we learned in school about why Europeans established North American colonies, we learned about economic reasons such as the fur trade and the ability to grow cash crops like tobacco or indigo. And we heard about religious reasons, such as when the Puritans migrated to New England and William Penn established Pennsylvania. But what you're saying is that North American colonization was really about India. How did this fact get omitted from our historical educations?
It gets missed because history tends to be written from a national perspective. This isn't unusual. It's certainly not only something that happens in American schools, but we tend to, as people write about history, as if the place that we live in was sort of destined to follow a particular track, and a very local one for the most part. And we sort of think of globalization and people thinking globally as something that's happened really recently. And you see this all the time, of course, in journalism and the news. And it's a very easy conceit for us to fall into that, the whole world's new in our time, that connection and thinking globally is something that's very new. But when I was researching for this book, the thing that constantly struck me was that even though people didn't know very much, the English people didn't know a whole lot about the rest of the world, they were thinking about it constantly. And so it's sort of easy to imagine how this has been missed because it doesn't fit a lot of our other narratives for how the world has changed.
Let's look at the connections between North America, England, and India in a bit more detail. Kyle would like to know how the trade between Great Britain, America, and India worked. Would you tell us how that trade operated? Like, what goods did England and North America send to India, and what goods did they receive from India in return?
The hope had been that the English were going to be able to sell all kinds of woolen goods and English goods to India. But when they started actually trading with India, they found out pretty quickly that people in India really weren't interested in any of that stuff, primarily because India was socioeconomically really more developed than England. It had far better manufactured goods in particular. And the things that English people found, like pepper and spices, they certainly had markets. They also found things like cotton and furniture, and those goods could have markets too. The way the trade develops is buying pepper, spices, and cotton cloth and silk cloth from India and shipping it to London. And it has to come to London because of the company's monopoly. And once it's in London, it can be taxed and regulated by the state. And from there, it can be distributed throughout the English Empire, and it can also be sent beyond into Europe and to Africa. And so this is how the trade's really sort of moving. And what the Indian people want in exchange for all their amazing stuff is silver, because there's really very little else that the English can offer. And they certainly try. They're sort of constantly trying to figure out, what can we offer these people? Like, they don't want anything that we have. And so they try and they come up with some things like glassware and a few things here and there that create small markets or that have small markets in India, but nothing that can really answer the question of how to pay for India's goods other than silver. And so it's really the silver that drives the trade forward.
Where did England get all the silver to trade with India? Because I can't think of any big silver mines in English North America or even in England.
Right. And this is one of the reasons that critics are so worried about this trade. And they're thinking, wow, we're exporting all this silver, and silver is a scarce thing for England. We need to be hoarding this stuff for ourselves. And this is worth real value. And they're sort of have this obsession with the idea of intrinsic value, that silver is something that has real value, whereas the goods they're getting, pepper and spices and cloth, these things are ephemeral. They are used up. They are consumed. And so their value isn't real. So there's a lot of fear about all this export of silver and then how to get it. And the response to that is, well, by exporting this stuff outwards, we can get silver in exchange. And so by exporting cotton cloth to Europe or to Spanish America, they can get silver as payment for it and then use that silver to buy more cloth. And so it's true that the kind of need for silver is one of the central problems for the East India Company until the 1750s and 60s.
How successful was the English East India Company in competing with its foreign counterparts, like the Dutch and French East India Companies?
Initially, it's relatively weak. And the Dutch have a program of conquest and fortification in the Spice Islands that's very successful from the perspective of the European imperial powers. And the English don't really manage to do anything like that. And they're sort of stuck working in trade in which they're the small partner in the trading relationship, the weak partner in the trading relationship with places like the Mughal Empire. So for them, initially, they're not doing particularly well. It takes them decades and a century, really, before they start to become a really effective challenger to the Dutch in particular, who have, like I said, sort of created these colonies and fortifications in the Indian Ocean. And the English try to do that. They try in places like Madagascar, but they're just not very successful at it from their perspective.
We know that enslaved labor played a significant role in the economic development of the British North American colonies. Did enslaved people play any role in the development of the British trade with India?
Absolutely. And this is a place, again, where our sort of focus on what I would consider more local history, on a national history, or more recently on sort of an Atlantic history, and on a sense of European strength. And I think that it's amazing in how many places in our historical narrative European superiority sort of stays kind of part of the narrative, even when we sort of know better. Criticisms of Eurocentrism appear certainly in high school textbooks and other places. We're sort of consciously trying to see this, and yet it's so kind of deeply ingrained in history as a discipline that it's easy to miss points at which it's kind of there shaping our understanding. And so in this case, one of the stories that's often been told is the triangle trade, and that it's goods sort of going from England or Britain that are made there, that are shipped to Africa in exchange for enslaved people to be sent to plantations in Mesoamerica and the Caribbean and in North America. And in fact, sort of when we look at what Europeans are taking and the English and then the British are taking to Africa, it's really not dominated by European goods. The societies that the Europeans encounter in Africa are quite developed. And again, what they want isn't European stuff, just like the Indians don't want European stuff. what they want is Indian stuff, just like the Europeans want Indian stuff. And so what the Africans demand in exchange for African people is cotton cloth and silks, in particular, though, cotton cloth from India. And so the triangle trade kind of has cut off a whole part of the world, the part which is actually supplying the majority of the goods which are being used to buy enslaved Africans. And that part of the world is India. And so, I don't know, I've sort of thought about ways to rethink the triangle trade. And the best thing I could come up with sort of like a bow tie where you have India and the Indian Ocean on one side, and on the other you have the Atlantic. And they're knotted together through London because these Indian goods have to move first through London and then re-exported to Africa to buy enslaved people. And in fact, it's the quantities that are being exported to Africa are enormous. It's the second largest market for East India goods from Britain after Europe. And those cotton piece goods, what we call piece goods or cotton cloth, are really essential to supporting the entire apparatus of the trade in enslaved people and of the plantations that they work on.
If North American colonization was about India for the English, and you mentioned that the English were hoping to build their own silk farms and grow some of the resources they could get in India in North America, then how big of a role was the India trade in driving the development of chattel slavery in North America?
India is sort of fueling the ability to grow the trade by providing these cotton goods in particular, and also things like cowrie shells, which are very valuable shells on the Atlantic coast of Africa. But it's the supplier, in a sense. It's not necessarily driving demand for enslaved people. It's a way to kind of make the trade work, but I don't think it's really the main driver. And the East India Company itself is hesitant to engage with the trade in enslaved people directly itself, although it certainly is involved in some ways, and some historians have done work recently on thinking about European involvement in an Indian Ocean trade in enslaved people. But the role of India in the trade in enslaved people in the Atlantic Ocean is really to provide the goods that allow that system to operate. It's not necessarily the goal to kind of expand the system. And I think there's enough of demand, in particular for sugar and later for coffee in Europe, that it's that demand for those commodities grown by the enslaved people that really drives that trade.
We've been talking about a very big, expensive, and valuable trade. And of course, England wanted to do what it could to protect that trade. So Parliament passed laws like the Navigation and Calico Acts. In previous episodes, we've discussed the Navigation Acts and how they required nearly all goods to and from the colonies to go to England to be taxed before they reached their final destinations. But we've never heard about the Calico Act. Jonathan, would you tell us what calico is and why Parliament passed a law to protect it?
Calico is cotton cloth. And one of the things I do with my students is sort of look around and say, is anyone here wearing wool today? And not very many people raise their hands. And I ask if anyone, is wearing linen today. And again, usually we don't get any hands at all. And today we basically all wear cotton cloth. Universally, it is what most people in the world wear on a daily basis. And before the 18th century, that simply wasn't the case. Cotton cloth was made in a few places in the world, but its manufacturing production was dominated by India. And this stuff was called by the English calico. And there was a few different variations. There was calico, which was a dyed and printed fabric. There was chintz, which had often fancier painting on it. And then there was muslin, which was usually white, sometimes embroidered. And these kind of all got lumped together often as being calico. And initially, there's not a lot of demand for this stuff in England. It actually takes a long time, and the East India Company has to work really hard to try and figure out how to get people to buy this stuff. And they don't have good access, like the Dutch, to spices, and so they need something else to be their kind of staple commodity. And calico is what they sort of turn to, and they keep trying to figure out ways to get people in England or Europe or anywhere to buy this in greater quantities. And it's not until the 1660s and 70s that they sort of finally figure out that what they need to do is send patterns and designs and ideas to the Indian producers, who will then make stuff that will be really appealing to consumers in England and in Africa and elsewhere. And so what they sort of figure out is that people in England don't want typical Indian fabric, which has a dark background on it. What really amazes people outside of India about Indian fabric is its pure whiteness. And this idea that it can be bleached to be really, really white and then have really bright designs printed on top of it. And that's amazing to them because they can't do that with wool. It's very difficult even today to do that with wool. They can't do it with linen. They just can't make anything that's white and that they can wash and that stays white and that retains its bright, vivid colors. And it's one of the reasons, of course, that we still wear cotton all the time today because it's easy to care for and we can make it white and clean it very easily. And so this is sort of amazing once the East India Company figures out how to sort of appeal to English consumers. It's amazing how fast this explodes in popularity. And this goes from tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands to literally millions of pieces of this fabric being imported into England each year in the 1670s and 80s. And this creates a lot of sort of back pressure in England, a lot of concern in England from England's own fabric producers. England has a huge woolen industry and a silk industry that's been growing rapidly. And so there's really great fear amongst these people that they're going to kind of lose all of their jobs, all of their livelihoods, because everyone's going to just wear cotton cloth imported from India. And this fear drives the creation of protectionist acts, the Calico Act. And the British government and the East India Company are literally attacked by violent mobs and pushed into forbidding English consumers from using the best Indian goods, the most popular Indian goods. And there's a first attempt at this in 1700, has a bunch of loopholes in it, and so it doesn't really work very well. So then the government has to pass, sort of again, forced by uprising in the streets in the 17-teens. And in this period, English weavers and their supporters are beating women in the streets, are stripping their clothes off them, throwing acid on them. It's extremely violent. And so the government, again, is sort of pushed to act. And this time it creates a much tighter sort of set of regulations that ban English consumers and British consumers from buying any cloth that's made out of cotton and is printed.
It's one thing to pass a law, it's another to enforce it. And we know from our study of the American Revolution that Parliament had a tough time enforcing the Navigation Acts in North America. I mean, smuggling was such a big problem that in part, that's why Parliament passed the Stamp Act, Townshend Acts, and tea duty between 1765 and 1773, all of which, by the way, Parliament had a difficult time trying to enforce. So, how successful was Parliament in being able to enforce the Calico Acts?
This is a question I thought about a lot, and they're actually reasonably successful. And it's kind of hard to know about sort of smuggling, and it's hard to get information on this. But there's a few ways to sort of realize that it must have been working pretty well. And one of the things to understand about the Calico Acts is that they don't apply in America. And so American consumers were still sort of free to buy the best Indian cloth. And this added sort of incentive to protect that trade for the East India Company. The East India Company doesn't trade directly to America, but it controls the supply of all the Indian goods going to America. And so the way I can sort of get a sense that the company remained the primary supplier of these things is by looking at merchant records and sort of seeing that they're buying a lot of this stuff legally, by looking at newspaper advertisements and seeing that these goods being imported from the East India Company are sort of constantly being advertised in the newspapers. And they're being brought from London. And that's, again, constantly highlighted in the advertisements. And the reason that's highlighted is because it's the legal goods that are coming from London. The illegal goods would be coming from other places. But London's sort of seen as the source of the finest of these goods and as the legal place for these goods. And then finally, when there are opportunities to sort of work around the system, and one example I talk about in the book is when two sort of French East India ships get captured by English forces in America, that there's immense excitement around the sudden availability of goods from those ships that is legal because they're sort of seized in wartime. It's legal to have those goods, but it is a way to sort of circumvent the system and structure that's in place requiring colonists to have India goods only from the East India Company. And if it was sort of easy to regularly get these goods, there wouldn't be that excitement. If a smuggling trade was really, huge and and successful, we really wouldn't see London constantly in the advertisements. And then when we turn to the merchant records, we wouldn't see the merchants sort of constantly placing orders with their London suppliers who are buying from the East India Company sales. So it's not to say that there's sort of no smuggling. Certainly there was. But in general, the enforcement seems to have worked reasonably well. And the sort of second quick side of that is that the East India Company was also pretty good at supplying what people wanted. And it could typically do it pretty cheaply because it managed to increasingly establish itself in India. Again, instead of working in the Spice Islands, in India as the sort of most successful in getting the best and cheapest Indian cloth. And so that was the easiest way to outdo the smugglers, was simply to be better at getting the good quality goods.
One of the intriguing ideas in your book, Selling Empire, is that the Calico Acts and the enforcement efforts around those acts help to differentiate and structure people in Britain, India, and North America as producers and consumers, all with different types of moral and economic goals. Would you tell us about this idea and how this differentiation took place?
It's likely that for a long time, English people sort of imagined their colonists as being somewhat inferior in a variety of ways. But what the Calico Acts do is really legally structure the colonists as fundamentally different people. It sort of does that by saying that they are able to buy products that are illegal in Britain itself. And a whole set of arguments around why those things should be illegal in Britain are moral. That Indian cloth leads to moral decline, that Indian cloth is dangerous luxury, that it effeminizes men and makes them more like women and takes away their manliness, and that for women, it corrupts them and it strips away obvious indicators of the social order. It's hard to tell who a wealthier woman is compared to a poor woman when they can all afford the same basic cotton cloth and they all want very similar cotton cloth. And so these sort of sets of powerful moral arguments suddenly don't apply to colonists in America. So the assumption is they're either already sort of morally corrupted, or I think probably what most people in England sort of figured, doesn't really matter. They're just colonists. Who really cares about their moral status? It's not a threat like it would be within Britain itself. And so that sort of puts them in a different moral place. And then from the production side, people in the colonies are discouraged quite actively and legally from producing finished manufactured products. It's fine for colonists and it's encouraged for colonists to grow things, to then export, to be manufactured or processed in Britain. But to actually make their own cloth or to make their own hats is heavily discouraged through all sorts of different regulations. But at the same time, colonists are actually being encouraged to buy goods made by people in India, people who aren't even English or British subjects. And so you sort of see this positioning of colonists as these ideal consumers, people who are just going to buy and support all kinds of different imperial companies and systems. And in particular, they're going to support the East India Company by buying India's goods that English people aren't going to be able to buy. And so it's really fascinating to think of the colonists really as these ideal consumers, people sort of positioned in America to buy stuff, not just English stuff, as we kind of conventionally think of, but stuff from the East India Company too.
You've kind of addressed this question in passing, but I wonder if we might get a more direct answer. Were the Calico Acts and Parliament's regulation of trade between the colonies and India a starting point for how the British people came to view Britons in America as different from themselves and perhaps as not fully British?
I'm not sure if they're the starting point. Again, I think that there's a sense, even from the earliest moments of colonization, that there's some sort of difference. And there's also, of course, people in England and in the colonies who argue there is no difference, that they're exactly the same, and that Virginia is just this extension of England. But there's definitely others who sort of feel that it is different, that it is a place where there's more moral risk, where certain types of people go, where there's certainly risks of becoming like Native American people. And so I don't know that it's the point at which it begins, but it's undoubtedly a point at which it becomes legalized in a lot of different ways. And it's really, as I was sort of describing, it really kind of codifies and makes legal these positions of the colonists as being really different from English people in England or British people in Britain itself. So again, I'm not sure it's the beginning, but it definitely is a transitional moment of ramping up this sense of difference.
At the end of Selling Empire, Jonathan presents the idea that, quote, The world's different places, products, and peoples are often wondrous, appalling, and frightening because of how we think about them, not because of what we claim they are. And yet, the systems we create, with our ideas and with buying, selling, and consuming our possessions are real, and they have real implications, end quote. Jonathan, would you expound upon these ideas? Would you tell us how the story of the British, American, and Indian trade that took place between the 16th and early 19th centuries has informed our present day?
It seems to me there's quite a few different ways, and I'm going to work through a few of them here. The first, I think, is that we typically think of empires conquering weak people, and that's kind of how they expand. But really what's amazing to me about the story of Britain's relationship with India is that India is the strong power for most of the period. India has more people, more money, it's more sophisticated manufacturers. It is really the superior partner. And yet, the goal for England is to try and figure out ways to use India, either as inspiration for its own colonization or inspiration to produce its own cotton goods, and India's goods will be a driving force in England's Industrial Revolution. Ways to sort of exploit and use India's own strengths to England's advantage. It seems to me this is maybe the better way to think about how empires grow and expand. It's not just taking advantage of the weak, although that's part of it. It's really figuring out ways to take advantage of other people's strengths. The sort of second big issue I think sort of this story informs about our world today is our concern with the decline of American manufacturing. And there's really good reasons to be concerned about it. But remarkably, American manufacturing has been a pretty short-lived phenomenon. In many ways, the colonists were here as consumers. And that sort of consuming position continued to drive America's trading relationship for a long time. And the period in which America is a big manufacturing powerhouse has really been relatively recent and short-lived. And this struggle between consuming and producing, and of course, a healthy economy needs both consumption and production, has been a real struggle throughout all of the history from English settlement in America forward, trying to sort of balance production and consumption. This really isn't a new problem. It's a very, very old one. And it connects to a lot of other very current stories in American politics today. One of the things we haven't talked about is India's role in the American Revolution. And the sort of Tea Party narrative today is about high taxes, powerful government, these sorts of concerns. And it's not that they're completely missing the history, but they don't really fit with the concerns of colonists and patriots in the 1770s. And one of the things that I always ask my students is, what's the revolution over? And I'm always told, high taxes, no taxation without representation. This is really sort of, everywhere we look in our history and in our politics. But the amazing thing is, the American Revolution doesn't happen when the English and British raise taxes. It doesn't happen over the Sugar Acts. It doesn't happen over the Stamp Act. It doesn't happen over the Townshend duties. All of these things increase taxes, and yet patriots don't revolt. Colonists don't revolt. They revolt starting in 1773 over the Tea Act. And then I ask my students, what does the Tea Act do? And pretty much everyone says, raises taxes, or they have no idea. And the amazing thing is, the Tea Act lowers taxes. And that's what starts the American Revolution. Not increasing taxes, but falling taxes. And it lowers taxes on tea, in particular to help the East India Company. And it's the great fear over the East India Company, a company which had taken control of one of the richest places in the world, Bengal in India, and then had proceeded to oversee a really horrific famine, a famine in which millions of people died in the late 1760s and early 1770s. And the news of this famine is in every colonial newspaper and over again before the Tea Act is passed. And so at the very moment that colonists are sort of being told, support the East India Company, buy lots of tea, we'll make it really cheap for you, they're reading this news about the East India Company being really tyrannical and being really awful and doing really terrible things. And it's this kind of fear of exploitation, of corporate corruption, of the collapse of sort of what they perceive as British rights and freedoms. It's this that finally pushes colonists to revolt. And it's not higher taxes that's really the sort of driving concern. And so I think here, this is a story that's really much different than the story we often think about when we think about the revolution. revolution. It's much deeper, more complicated. I think in some ways it's actually more inspiring. But it's also in some ways uglier, because the other thing that these colonists are really afraid of is being treated like Indians in India, or being enslaved like the people that they themselves enslaved from Africa. And so the revolution is also really about protecting white privilege in this society. So I think there's a lot we can sort of draw from in our own politics today. And then finally, one last thing, if we think about the Brexit vote, if we go back to Britain itself, and sort of a lot of amazement that this has happened. But from a historical perspective, again, it has very clear roots, because in Britain's dealings with India in the 17th and 18th centuries, we can see this great fear of Islam and corruption from Muslim powers, and of corruption from Europe, and corruption from Spain and France, and conflict with Spain and France. And so this dual thread that has really helped drive support for Brexit in Britain, for becoming separate from the European Union, really does fit this kind of long pattern of deep distrust of both Islamic people and of Europe, and particularly Catholic Europe itself.
It's time for the Time Warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently, or if someone had acted differently.
The Time Warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
We just heard the English colonization of North America had a lot to do with trade with India. Jonathan, in your opinion, what would have happened if India hadn't existed? What would the lack of an India have meant for the English colonization of North America?
There probably still would have been interest in colonization. It's not clear to me how much interest there would have been. Part of the attraction of India was the sort of promise of spices and commodities that were really rich and wonderful. And without that kind of allure, without that sense that these things would be available somewhere else, they could be reproduced somewhere else, the arguments for colonization would have had to have been fundamentally different. And there were arguments in favor of colonizing from the sort of Spanish perspective. The idea that English people would go to North America and find gold and silver. And certainly we sort of learn about those things in school. Those weren't necessarily the driving arguments, though, once colonization really started. And people like Smith were really uncomfortable, actually, with some of those arguments, and others were even more uncomfortable with those arguments. And what they really wanted was not an empire of extraction. And they saw getting silver out of the ground through mines as a really kind of, in their minds, Catholic and dangerous pursuit. What they saw as the moral and honorable way to wealth was labor, growing stuff and making stuff. Now, this didn't necessarily mean it had to be free labor. People like Smith were sort of in favor of using enslaved labor if necessary. They weren't necessarily against that. But still, they saw there being something fundamentally different about products being produced by labor than those that were simply extracted. And the products produced by labor were things that were, of course, grown and manufactured, the same kinds of things that they were thinking about when they were thinking about India. And so those arguments may not have been available if India wasn't available, which would have left people with only the arguments about extracting gold and silver. And once that gold and silver wasn't found, it might have been more difficult to convince people to continue. And it might have been more difficult to convince people to even go for gold and silver based on these other kinds of fears of gold and silver being themselves, through their extraction, corrupting. And so I think it's probable that we still would have seen some real interest in colonization, but the way in which it unfolded and the arguments made to support it, and potentially even its survival, would have looked much different.
So, Jonathan, what comes after your exploration of India? What aspect of history are you researching and writing about now?
One of the things that happened when I was writing this book is I got piles of stuff that didn't fit. The book's already too long, and I couldn't figure out what am I going to do. And I probably write another book with all the stuff that I cut out of it. And one of the things that kept striking me that I sort of kept having to pull out, because it just seemed to be creating its own story, was the position of elephants in the history of the British Empire. And elephants sort of appear in all kinds of ways. They appear as sort of emblems of empire. You think about Elephant and Castle in London today, but also the way in which the Royal African Company uses an elephant as part of its emblem. And we see these elephants sort of used as beasts of burden and war. And then we see these elephants used also as representations of India and of India's people. And as the British are engaging more and more with India, one of the things they do is start importing more and more of these elephants, sort of put in coffee shops and parade around. And this doesn't happen in the colonies. The colonists don't import elephants. But remarkably, pretty soon after independence, Americans start to import elephants as they begin trading directly with India as well. And these elephants that become paraded around America become caught up in all kinds of stories about the creation of the new American nation.
Where should we look for more information about you, Jonathan, and how we can contact you if we still have questions about the English trade with India and how that India trade affected the colonization of North America?
The book is readily available on Amazon. And then if you want to get in touch with me, the easiest place is just to go to history.ucr.edu on the internet, history.ucr.edu, and you can find my profile there.
Jonathan Eacott, thank you for helping us explore the English trade with India and its development during the 17th and 18th centuries.
Well, thanks so much for giving me the opportunity. It's been great.
Globalization, or the interaction and integration of peoples and businesses around the world, is not a new phenomenon. From the 16th century onwards, countries and colonies around the world have been interacting with and influencing one another. As Jonathan revealed, England's trade with India had profound implications for the English North American colonies. In fact, many in England argued for the settlement of the North American colonies simply because colonization seemed to be a great way to bolster, promote, and supplement the India trade. And India's influences didn't stop with colonization. In the 1770s, it appears that the India trade played a sizable role in aggravating tensions between Great Britain and her North American colonies. Now, unfortunately, we didn't have time to explore this idea more fully today, but from the way Jonathan described it, it seems like the East India Company's handling of the famine in Bengal during the early 1770s drove colonists to further fear the company and revolt against it in 1773. Which leaves us to wonder, is this really what sparked the tea crisis of 1773? I think it's an interesting and timely question, as next week is the anniversary of the Boston Tea Party, which took place on December 16, 1773. So next week, we're going to explore the tea crisis of 1773. Look for more information about Jonathan, his book, Selling Empire, plus everything we talked about today on the show notes page, benfranklinsworld.com/111. If you think important history makes great reading, why not check out books from Cornell University Press? Cornell has created a special sales page just for you, where they're offering titles like Moral Commerce at a 30% discount. And this is a great deal, because the sales page offers Cornell books cheaper than you can get them on Amazon. And I know they're cheaper because I checked the prices on all the books. So for example, Christian Imperialism by Emily Conroy Kreutz, who you may remember was our guest historian in episode 47, is $45 on Amazon and just $31.50 when you visit our special sales page at benfranklinsworld.com/Cornell. Finally, do you think we should have learned more about the English-India trade in school? Send your answers to liz@benfranklinsworld.com, tweet me @LizCovart, or post a comment on the show notes page or in our listener community on Facebook.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.